Welcome to our final Outback conversation. Today, the Outback Alliance members and key stakeholders will be reflecting on the themes and messages that have emerged from the diverse experiences described throughout the webinar series as a whole. The focus is on joining the dots and possible policy pathways for the future.
Right, so thank you everyone for joining us again today in the final of our series on Outback Australia and the impact of this horrible virus. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting. In my case, that's the Jinnaburra people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I extend those respects to any other Indigenous people who may be joining us here today. I'm Edwina, I work for Pew in Queensland, and I'm facilitating the session. But as you may have noticed, things today are a little bit different. We've set it up more as a meeting than as a webinar, which means that everyone can kind of jump in with questions without having to relay them through me. But in the interest of kind of not all talking over the top of one another, we do still have a system. I just ask you to keep yourself on mute unless you're talking. And when you do have a question, just put a Q in the chat box, and then I'll throw over to you. You unmute, ask your question. So that way we can all kind of have a turn at getting our questions out there. So as you are probably aware, today is the session where we're trying to join the dots and bring together some of the kind of themes and pieces that have popped up through the first sessions or the other sessions in this series. There's obviously a few moving pieces. We were just discussing that a minute ago. You know, one of the biggest is obviously the virus itself. After initially plotting a course, I think where we were all feeling like we might be out of the woods a bit and we're feeling more positive. Obviously the situation in Melbourne is worrying, and we do not know how that's going to play out across the rest of the country at this stage. But I think one thing that we do know for sure is that the virus's impact in rural, regional and remote areas has been quite different to that in urban areas, and we've discussed that throughout this series. Some of those impacts have been for better, some of them have been for worse, and that's what we want to dig into a little bit more today. So we're joined again by Frank Quinlan from the Royal Flying Doctor Service and Andy Bubb from Ninti-One. And I am going to throw over to Andy first, who's going to take us back through some of the key themes and highlights from the other presentations throughout this session.
Thanks, Edwina, and I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country from where we're all meeting, and I think it is a diverse and spread out group today. I'm coming to you from Yidinji country in far north Queensland. I've just got a couple of slides that I'd like to share, so hopefully everyone can see this when I bring it up. That's coming through good, Edwina? Yep, great. So we just wanted to set the scene for this conversation today by just having a quick look back over where this conversation series come from and the ground that we've covered in the conversation series. So framing it around those questions at the start, when the Outback Alliance kind of decided to have this webinar series, it was really looking at how's COVID hit the Outback? What have been the impacts? And I think we were looking at it from a probably the worst case scenario at the start, and potentially the impacts could have been a lot greater than what we've seen today. We wanted to think about the policy change that's necessary to support Outback communities and keep them thriving. And I think that in the early days there was a lot of wonder, a lot of fear as to whether that would be how that would happen and what that would look like. And also, what are the lessons from the Outback? Because clearly at the start, the whole idea of planning and preparing a long way in advance is something that Outback people are doing all the time. So what were the lessons that we could take from that to take back to policymakers and to other people so that they could get a good sense of some of the solutions that people across the Outback are just doing day in, day out. Now I've included that map in there because I suppose I just wanted us to have a quick few seconds of reflection to think that if we were trying to hold this type of conversation or this type of meeting in the past, distance past of maybe 1 year ago, what would it have looked like? And I think it probably would have involved us all flying to one of those dots on the map for a couple of days, and a lot of flights, travel, hotels and other things. People missing out because it was too much of a resource drain to go and do something like that. So this webinar series is really reflecting of what the pandemic, I suppose, has brought about. We are kind of aligning this to the joining the dots, and obviously this is up on our website, but I suppose I'd just like to mention that it's not looking at things through this webinar series. It's not a, it's an area that we've already been looking at, and the COVID lens is another way of looking at it. So it's probably brought some things into much sharper focus, but it's not necessarily something that we haven't been thinking about. I think the impact of COVID has just been so far reaching across everything that we do that that's probably been the biggest surprise, that we've been dealing with a whole lot of new terminology. So everyone's familiar with Zoom now. Self-isolating means something. People think about hoarding, they think about lockdown. We know what job seeker and job keeper. So there's all these different things that have come about directly as a result of the COVID pandemic that's really impacted the nation, and obviously really impacted people across the Outback. Just to refresh everyone's memory, I've just kind of grabbed some of these the thumbnails from our website, and I would encourage you to go back and have a look at the videos, because there's so much rich information in there, directly from people as they were living and experiencing COVID and the impacts of it across the Outback. So Leanne and Emma got into the conversation right at the start, and there was quite a contrast, I suppose, from what Leanne was experiencing, whereas Emma kind of mentioned that for her as a pastoralist, the impacts weren't too big in the sense that there was a lockdown, but she was still able to go about her work, running the business, getting out, selling the beef, you know, making money that way. Neighbours involved in tourism and other things, there was a fair impact there though. So it was just quite a contrast that came through. Frank's going to speak some more today. I'd draw your attention to John's presentation. That was another really insightful presentation that John made from Darwin, and kind of just spoke about how the pandemic had meant that things happened a whole lot faster. Things previously had been a little bit difficult in some areas to make them happen. There was a real cut down in the length of the communication chains, and things were able to happen really quickly in response. And John was looking at how that could be hopefully maintained beyond the pandemic. The housing presentation from Rod and Tammy kind of covered off a whole lot of issues in Central Australia, but I think one of the really important messages that Tammy conveyed was that out in Aboriginal communities, some people were quite relieved by the lack of churn and the lack of movement of people around, and how that had really kind of aided community cohesion. And Tyrone brought that up again later in the series. Barry and Jimmy spoke about the environmental issues, and Jimmy raised the point of a little bit outside of conservation, but just how some of the supply chains, the hoarding and things that were going on in the cities, how they were impacting on a lack of fresh supplies and that getting out to people in communities and remote areas. Alana had a great presentation and insights into education, and I think education is one of those things that's come across from this pandemic as an area. I think teachers are going to be far more appreciated forever after people have attempted homeschooling. Education from an Outback perspective and access to bandwidth data and some things becoming unmetered was a really quick policy response that was made, and hopefully similar things can be done in the future. Fran and David kind of gave a really good overview of some of the economic recovery and the impacts that were going on, but there's so many unknowns still in the whole economic recovery and where we're going to. It's going to be one of the ongoing challenges of the pandemic. And then Tyrone, Liz and Mark earlier in the week gave us a really good insight into some of the positives that were coming out of the quick response people were making, and how that while it had been a huge disruption, people were adapting really well, coming up with new innovative solutions, and that there was, you know, light at the end of the tunnel, or hope where we are at now in what is the new normal. It's not something that's in the distance. We're in that now, and it's going to be what we now deal with into the future. So that's just a quick summary, Edwina, and I'll just stop the share there.
Fantastic. Thank you for that recap, Andy. I will throw over to you now, Frank, for your presentation.
Terrific, and thank you. Thanks everyone for joining. And I recognise that I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra, and join Andy in paying respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I wanted to share just a few brief reflections, really, more in the manner of getting a conversation started, sadly in a way, than in the manner of answering all of the challenges. As I reflected ahead of today, my sense is that the world has changed, possibly dramatically, and because we're all in the middle of it, I'm not entirely sure that we had the answers yet to what the future looks like. But as folks who are seeking to influence the political agenda, I'll just share that one little slide, more for amusement than anything else, that my reflection broadly is that in some senses nothing has changed, and in some senses everything has changed, and I want to just talk through that a little bit. I think we've given evidence really to the thought along this series of discussions that regional voices remain at the margins of the mainstream political discourse. So in that sense, nothing has changed. Remote voices can really be quite at the fringe of that. I think we also have a sense that the challenges that are often faced by remote communities, and more importantly people living in remote communities, can appear to be both timeless and insatiable, but they seem to be the same problems that we've had year on year on year on year, and they seem to have resisted our efforts to change them along the way. And we still face the reality that whilst we're asking people to, as I like to say, to mine minerals and to find our food and our fibre and to attend our traditional...
Frank, sorry, I'm just going to jump in and cut you off there. I don't know if it's my headset or your microphone. Is it Frank's headset? If we could get it, it's Frank's microphone that's crackly, or...
Okay, is that...
Or anyone else? Yes, it is. Yeah, we're just having some audio problems, Frank. Your microphone's a little crackly.
Okay, I wonder if I might quickly, if people will bear with me, I wonder if I might quickly put a headset in and just see if I can connect that. And I might not share my screen while I'm doing that because it'll take me a moment. Just bear with me.
We've got a beautiful picture of the ocean there that we can enjoy.
Is that better for folks? Is that better for folks now? Oh, great. Whoever would have thought at the start of all of this that I'd be able to repair a set of headphones in 10 seconds during a webinar presentation. But anyway, we've all picked up new skills along the way. I was just saying that that folks that share our principal concern are really located a very long way from a lot of the centres of decision making and so forth. So, you know, all of that could be a pessimistic background to some of this discussion. But I also want to say in a way that everything has changed, and I'm not sure whether that will be lasting or not sure what it exactly means. But I think on a whole raft of fronts, this sort of theme that's developed through the COVID crisis, that we're all in this together, actually has some legs. And I think there is a sense across the broad community of just some sort of recognition that we can't consider one without considering the whole. And I think the example of the lockdown in Victoria today is a good example of that, because I think there's a sense that, you know, it's that they're taking one for the team in many respects. It's a sense that we could all be in similar circumstances were it not for some good fortune. And so I think that changes the map. And I think the shift that we've seen towards recognising that we have to invest stimulus, for instance, by putting cash in the hands of individuals, is a huge change that recognises that the community and the individual are inextricably linked. And I think that was true, certainly in much of what we heard. I think it's also true, if I might say, and I far be it from me to speak for Indigenous communities, but certainly as an observer, as a casual observer, I think that some of the agency that has been taken up by Indigenous communities in response to the emerging pandemic have really demonstrated that communities do have strength acting together. And, you know, some of the early community lockdowns, some of the response that communities have had from the Commonwealth Government, I think just, again, gives us hints that some of these things can change, and that local communities might perhaps have more agency than we gave them credit for. I think part of the theme of the presentation that I was part of earlier in the series was this notion that communities and non-government organisations and governments have found a way through this crisis of working very quickly together and of making very substantial changes, of investing very substantial amounts of money, and of implementing policies that have made a real difference for the good. And I have a broad sense in the amongst many of the folks that I talk to, right through from people in the community right through to various ministries, that I don't think anyone wants to see that changed. That, you know, why would we go back to those bureaucratic, hard to shift, long discussions about action before we get to action? So hopefully that's another avenue in which everything has changed. And then the final thing I'd say in terms of a substantial change, and again, this was a reflection I shared last time, but I'm becoming more and more convinced of it, is that the role of the Commonwealth Government in response to not just pandemic, but we saw it in response to the bushfires, I think has changed, and has changed permanently, where once we looked to state governments largely to manage our coordination and response to emergency and disaster. I think the role of the Commonwealth has changed now, and I think seeing a shift away from the Council of Australian Governments, or COAG, towards this national cabinet, as new and as emerging as that idea is again something that has changed. So to quickly end with some reflections about my reflections on the series, it seems to me that through these discussions, we've sort of come to recognise, I think, or it's helped me to recognise, that the problems and needs of remote communities are finite, not abstract. And by that I mean that we often talk about, I think, the principles involved with access to services and shortage of capacity and all of those things as if they're abstract problems. And it occurs to me as part of this series, we've recognised that they're actually quite finite problems. We can count the number of people who are affected by many of these challenges, and we can locate them, we can put them on a map, and we can say, here are those people. And I think a focus that says this is a finite problem that we can manage and resolve is something that politically is more optimistic than an abstract problem that is an eternal challenge. I also think that we're seeing a new analysis of what is cost effective and what is quantifiable. And I think, again, one of the things that the COVID crisis has yielded for us in a public policy sense is that there is danger for everyone, there is danger for the whole of the country in running communities thin, in running communities on low capacity, in running communities that don't have access to some basic infrastructure and support. Because, as we've seen, if the pandemic breaks loose in one place, that can affect all of us. And I think that's something of a shift in our approach, and might assist us in our approaches to the Commonwealth. In terms then of influencing government, I think we do have, and will have for some time, a government that is hungry for solutions. And I think our organisations and our communities are well placed to present solutions. We're all aware of the problems, but I think governments will be hungry for solutions. even in their own language. I think we're already seeing governments hungry to provide stimulus. So I think there's an enormous recognition of the damage that has been caused to date by the COVID pandemic. I think we're yet to see the end of that, but I think governments are well focused on the idea that they will have a responsibility and a duty to stimulate local communities and to stimulate economies through the provision of funding for infrastructure and funding for activities that are built around employment and for activities that support health, because that's not just an investment in those local communities, but it is an investment in the whole. I think in parenthesis, there's a subset of that which is about saying we can prepare the readiness of communities for future pandemic and for future disaster, and that we need to have certain infrastructure and capacity in place to ensure that that's in place. And I think that's likely to be something that comes out of the wash up of all of this. I also think in terms of our political strategy that we need to recognise that governments seem to have been prepared to talk more to each other. It's not just the conversation that we've had with the Commonwealth government or with our state governments. It's the fact that state governments across the political spectrum have been having conversations with each other and are finding new ways of doing things and new ways of breaking through some of those traditional barriers. I'm not naive enough to suggest that some of the problems of our federation are simply going to go away or evaporate overnight. But I do think as organisations that have multiple pathways to government, we're very well placed where we find those solutions and where we can point to that infrastructure that's required and capacity that's required. We can now have a conversation with both levels of government, particularly Commonwealth and state and territory governments simultaneously in order to progress some of those arguments. All of that's the optimistic part of it. I will say on a less optimistic part of it, that we're also going to come out of this crisis and governments will be broke. Governments will be very indebted. They will have spent a lot of money, and I think that's going to be a lasting and long-term legacy. And as much as we might want to fight for a bigger share of the pie that's available and should continue to do so, I think we also need to exhaust every opportunity that we possibly can to come up with ideas that are about the reallocation of resources or the more efficient allocation of resources that already exist. And that will partly come down to us continuing to work more closely with each other and together, as we've done through this crisis, partly come down to us working with governments, but partly I think we, along with the whole of the Australian community, will just have to embrace the idea that it's going to be harder and harder for, possibly a decade or more to find some of that substantial cash that will be required for upfront investment in programs and services. I remain pretty optimistic, partly because I think we can couch the problems that we see as finite problems, and I think we are seeing emerging solutions that can be posited to government and that can be posited to governments that are ready to talk to each other and talk to us about implementing those solutions. So I might leave my reflections there in the hope that that gives us a chance to share reflections across the group.
Fantastic. Thank you, Frank. Mark, I think you have a question.
Yeah, thanks, Edwina, and thank you, Andy and Frank. Those were really great sort of reflections and summaries on the whole thing. I guess I was left out of those with a real feeling that, we have seen some really good solutions. We do have those arguments that you've just referred to, Frank, about the fact that there is a finite degree of intervention that would help. So it's not an endless thing in terms of those solutions. I think we also have the cases, as you said, to argue the importance of getting it right in Outback Australia on behalf of everyone, and we probably need to be able to articulate the benefits of that all the better. I have to say that I still have this feeling, though, that the bottom line is the attention, with all the best will in the world, the attention of the sort of political world will shift back, have to shift back to Melbourne and Sydney and places like that, because that's where most people are. And so I just wonder, taking all the really positive points that you made, what people's feelings are about how we institutionalize this a bit, just so that it doesn't slip away. We've seen, as you said, an extraordinary innovation in the National Cabinet as a really major change in structure, which just sort of happened just like that. So it's obviously not impossible to happen, but what would be the equivalent institutional innovation that would just mean that the things that you said, which people probably want to do, but will just lose attention on, might actually be put in place for the long term? But that's a sort of question to everyone, really.
I think if I might kick off, I think partly I often say the reverse of this, which is to say that many organisations, non-government organisations in particular, spend all of our time criticising governments for their failure to coordinate and their failure to communicate with each other, let alone ourselves. And then we set about to mimic precisely that dysfunction within our own structures and processes, and we fail to communicate with each other, and we set up multiple tiers that interfere with our communication. I'd like to think, and I don't mean this to sound directly self-serving to the Outback Alliance as it might, but I do think it's incumbent on us really to find the ways that we might have to collaborate together and to work through the structures and organisations that we have. You know, division is death in politics at all levels of politics, and I think that might require us to continue as we've done, I think, which is to say, let's identify some priorities together, let's prosecute them together in order, and that might mean that the priority that I would have at my number one actually goes on the back burner for a while, because as a group we've decided that a couple of other priorities need to go first, and that we need to prosecute them together. And you know, it's a bit trite perhaps to say that, but I do think taking particular issues forward in a concerted and consolidated manner is going to be more successful than you know, essentially letting 1,000 flowers bloom. But I'd welcome other thoughts on that too.
Andy, did you have anything you wanted to add on to that?
I think that message of trying to cut down the communication chain so things can happen quickly did come through in the series. And I think that capturing the success stories in a way that it's maintained as in corporate memory later on, so that when there's been really good examples of things that have worked over the past couple of months, don't let it go easily. Make sure that people remember it, are able to refer to it, mention it in policy, mention it in applications, and say that it is achievable, it can be done quickly, this is how we've done it in the past, and this is how we'd like to do it now. And I think if we can capture those examples and keep them at front of mind, it really could be the way that we sustain that, the progress that's been made.
Fantastic, thank you. Just a reminder to post questions with a Q or in the chat box there, and I've got one here. I'm just reading through it now. So I'm going to throw over to Frank. Are there any principles for seeking generic approaches for remote policy rather than asking for specifics for health? Something else for environment? That's a question from Barry Traill. So Barry, if I haven't explained that very well, I'm just reading through it here. Did you want to add a bit more context to that?
Yeah, thanks, Edwina. Yeah, no, look, you said it straight. And so Frank, and perhaps if I might throw to you, Kim Houghton, who I know is on, it's going on from what you said before, Frank, which is very cogent, working together, generic approaches. What I've always struggled with from my background in environment, is there any generic principles or ways of doing that? Because Canberra is siloed. because of the scale of things it's work at. Are there any principles we can follow to maximise our power?
Yeah, look, I think it's pretty challenging, Barry, to be honest. Partly, and this is just a technical issue for a moment, partly right at the core of government, the budget rules actually constrict or restrict that sort of approach. So if I'm the Minister for Health, I've got to take forward budget proposals that have budget savings in my portfolio, basically. If, you know, that's the way they take it to ERC. So if a education minister, for instance, wanted to take forward a proposal that demonstrated a long-term positive impact on health in communities, it's immediately disadvantaged because the saving that they're projecting in the long term is not in their portfolio. So the budget rules at the core of government really prevent that. Now, I think part of that is changing by this notion of national government and a larger role for cabinet, but I don't think we've overcome that yet. And you know, the number crunchers will be writing the budget as we speak. It doesn't really answer your question. I won't either answer your question with this observation too, that I don't think we've yet worked out how we can harness and capture the idea that the interventions that the conservation movement, for instance, might want to make in the community and the long-term environmental impacts have demonstrable long-term positive outcomes for health. And I think that's just incumbent then on us to find these sorts of alliances that we're talking about, where we can come together, whether it's health, whether it's conservation and the environment, whether it's social connectedness and inclusion. All of these things have mutually reinforcing positive benefits, but we don't yet have a very good way of prosecuting them together. So again, that's, I guess I'm more just agreeing with the challenge of the question than I am finding an answer, but I think the answer is something about us working together and putting forward those solutions together. But Kim, you've returned your camera on, so I hope that means you might be about to give us the answer.
I wish. Look, I think you're right. I think the negative side of all this for me is the actual political process and stuff. And you can see this, you know, when we've all gone to talk to local members, we've all gone to talk to ministers, and you can really see that narrowing of focus. They want to get some wins, you know, and it's an awful thing to say, and don't quote me outside this bloody room, but you know, people do cycle through these things, so it's hard. It's very hard at that really top level, sort of state and federal political level, to actually have somebody who's got the willingness to make a big change and to see it through. You know, we've seen change in Queensland state government, major changes. You know, the regional development minister going to Treasury, this sort of stuff happens all the time, and they just leave behind, you know, the previous portfolio stuff and all the relationships that went with it. The upside of it, though, you know, I'm relentlessly optimistic. I do like what NT government's done with local decision making, because I think it's that spatial boundary stuff that gives us a way through. I think the mechanisms of our Westminster system, the silos are so heavy, both within the bureaucracy and then, you know, the individual ministerial agenda is so time limited. I don't think we can expect much change there. We can talk grand visions, but you know, they'll nod politely and then move on. I reckon the answer lies in the place, in a place that's bounded by in a spatial sense. So that local decision-making approach to, you know, devolving some of that decision-making, allowing some of that accumulation of community resources to be dispersed. I think you used the words agency, Frank. I think it's really important, that community agency. And the example, and I keep banging on about this at the federal level, and I haven't checked it recently, but you know, DSS had moved towards a collective impact model where they were building over time, you know, what they were calling backbone organisations in a handful of target sort of pilot communities, with the medium-term view of, once the capacity was, they were confident in the capacity, that those organisations would then be essentially block funded to deliver a whole range of family and community support services, you know, in the best needs of, in the way that they understood the needs of their community. That, to me, is a way through this conundrum.
Fantastic. Thank you. Look, I've just been sent a message that someone saw Jimmy raising his hand. Jimmy, were you raising your hand with a question?
Thanks. I was trying to type one up and I suppose respond to both what Frank and Kim were talking about, because I think collective impact is a really important framework. Sometimes it's quite complicated for government people to understand that process of actually working together and breaking down the silos. I suppose being in the conservation environment sector, there's a lot of recommendations coming through from lots of different groups around packaging up energy, jobs, climate preparedness, conservation, and looking at ways of which, I suppose, which presents a really unique opportunity for at least the social services and environment sector to be putting forward plans to government around how we can join all of this up, because ultimately the costs of COVID have been one thing, the economic costs of the COVID shutdown is another, and then there's climate, which is, I think on social media there's memes of these tidal waves coming in of COVID, economic, climate, and then the biodiversity collapse. And so is there, given that this has been a response that the environment movements have made collectively by putting these proposals to government, are other sectors and people on the call seeing other sectors also putting these COVID recovery plans that link up a range of different areas, or is it kind of limited to the conservation sector? And is that a potential role that, I don't want to freak Dana out or anyone from Outback Alliance, but is that a role that we can play in helping put forward or connecting the dots more important now than, say, what it was 12 months ago?
Well, I just agree. I think that's wise counsel, Jim, in the right sort of direction. I'd comment just briefly, perhaps, that in health, more broadly than just the COVID response and preceding the COVID response, we've seen a sort of shift that recognises that transactional healthcare is not going to get us where we want to go, which is to say, I get an MBS item from an MBS practitioner today, and therefore I'm better tomorrow. This sort of sense of holistic care, of the links between my health and my environment and my local community and my employment and my food security and my financial security, all of those things are inseparable. And again, I think we risk making the same, or we risk committing the same error that we accuse governments of, which is to say existing in silos and each making our pitch sort of individually and separately. And so finding ways of breaking that down does seem to me to represent the future.
Anyone else got any thoughts on that point? I'll jump in and say,
just a really quick one. I mean, there is this enormous tension around environmental management and resource exploitation, isn't there? Which is that, the most cost-efficient way of doing it is to just to rip the guts out of it and then move on. And the lesson we're all trying to sort of communicate to all the powers that be is that this is short-sighted, but those market pressures are quite strong. There's a little glimmer, I think. Did I see somewhere in the media today that some couple of very large cattle stations sold in the Kimberley premium price because of its exceptional, according to the stories, land management by some long-term owners up there working with Indigenous people. So any little example, I think, which shows that there are both sort of social, economic, and environmental benefits from excellence in this sort of practice. Any examples that we can hang on will help to sort of undermine that orthodoxy that it's either one or the other. It's either exploitation or it's conservation, and we can't do both.
Okay. Vicky, did you have anything to add to that?
Thanks, Edwina. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Hi all, Vicky Fisher here on behalf of Secretary Andrew Metcalf from the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment in Canberra. And I have thoroughly enjoyed the webinar series, so thank you very much to everybody that's participated, and particularly Edwina for bringing it all together. Today is a fantastic conversation, and I just wanted to share rather than ask questions. Mark Tucker was appointed by Andrew as our Senior Industry Engagement Officer to assist agriculture, fisheries, forestry industry members through the COVID process. And in the engagement process, if you like, Mark was welcome to a range of roundtables at a national level, so peak industry bodies working with Commonwealth ministers. And then we moved out to the states and we were attending weekly roundtables with the state governments and their industry members, and just sharing, cross-pollinating. And it's so delightful to hear that other sectors are also sharing a little bit more, and that other bureaucracies, you know, your state agencies, are talking together a little bit more. And we did, for a moment there, have, you know, agriculture ministerial forums that weren't particularly political. You know, the world won't stay like that. But apart from all the other tools that have been suggested today, I think just that basic engagement and accountability to accountability of those engaging, if you like, to share as much of the information that they hear as possible. So I haven't contributed very much other than to say, yes, Jim, it is happening in other sectors, if you like. I know I'm here with agriculture and environment, and so climate is certainly part of our work as well. But the efforts to break down silos are ongoing.
Question, if I could,
Yeah.
Edwina, to Vicky. Is there any, again, a very broad question, will vary from department to department, Vicky. The virus has brought on, you know, more outreach, more innovation, more speed at times. Again, is there any, I'm just probing for anything more generic advice you might share, particularly with the federal bureaucracies, that helps facilitate that for us coming in as an alliance, you know, Royal Flying Doctors, NRM groups, Isolated Children's Parents Association, that doesn't just get perceived as like, this is just doesn't compute, and please go talk to your relevant silos.
I think part of it is the engagement with, so I guess from my perspective, the obvious minister for you would be it would be Hunt, and you'd be going through the health portfolio, but it is so essential to the agriculture portfolio too. And so whenever we're having those conversations or writing to our members or whatever, we probably should think a little bit outside the box. Who else needs to hear about this? Now, fair enough, copying in somebody, it might not get too far, but it's repeatedly sharing that advice and trying to engage a little bit more broadly. So we do look outside the box, I think, and increase the networks.
No, thanks, Vicky.
Sorry, that probably. So my advice there is to share. To share. I was only saying to wool producers last night. They were asking about how they get this message across, and I said, well, sure, send it to Little Proud. He's your minister, and it's his portfolio, and most of these problems are so trade. So make sure you copy in trade, and you want workers coming in from overseas, we need to have your immigration guys in there as well, and Home Affairs, Border Force. Spread the word. Make sure everybody is aware of your problem, and then those decision makers can get together, and if nothing else, you're shaming them into it.
Thanks, Vicky. Much appreciated.
That's all right. Not your typical bureaucratic response, perhaps.
And I see Alana's got a hand up.
Oh, Alana.
Hi, Edwina. Thanks, everyone. I'm here representing the Isolated Children's Parents Association. On that question of, I feel too that things that we do in terms of our young people and the education of our rural and remote people is impinges on the like agricultural portfolios and those sorts of things as well. The challenge that we have at times, and even with we have specific needs portfolios where we try and access the health department at times with various issues, and COVID saw that with the health guidelines for the boarding schools and those sorts of things. But we run into the problem of people see where the Isolated Children's Parents Association, you're dealing with education, go to the education department, and so sometimes we reach that brick wall where, well, why are you writing to us? Because we're not really relevant to what you're doing. You're doing education, and it's not necessarily relevant to the health minister or to the other various ministers. And so, I guess in as much as great advice that we do go looking at other perspectives, on the other side of the coin, they need to let us in and need to consider our thoughts when we do come to them and say, look, we feel like this is affecting your department, or your department may be able to help us here as well. Thanks.
Okay, any responses there to Alana's point? Scrolling across the boxes here.
It's Vicky. It's Vicky here. Sorry,
Vicky,
Edwina,
hi. Absolutely.
I was actually, the boarding school is a classic example where we've got kids isolated really during the school holidays in NT or Western New South Wales, then desperately trying to get back to school in South Australia, and they have to go into 2 weeks isolation. So it is one that I took up with South Australian government. We were given an exemption process to work through. I don't know whether Katie and the kids were successful, but I think you just got to keep trying. Somebody will listen to you somewhere along the line. Sorry.
It sounds like what we need is to create or lobby for an Outback portfolio, a Minister for Outback Affairs who could have a sort of carriage across all the top of these issues and the connectivity between them. Is there any other questions to come in? I've got a couple here, and then Mark, do you have a question?
Well, yeah, no, thanks. I mean, that last bit of conversation I think has been a really interesting one. And I just want to circle back from it to Frank's point right at the start of it. I think that that in the end, if the challenges, I don't think we're going to be able to avoid the fact that as people get busy again in their day-to-day lives, that the silos will continue operating. It would be lovely to think they wouldn't, but the question then does come: how do you bring together the thoughts that people have just had and try and create those more integrated structures that can try and deal with these things? And I just want to take people back to Kim's point about the regional level, because we have seen times, for example, on the Eyre Peninsula a few years ago, where the NRM group worked with the Regional Development Group, which worked with a local group of local governments. And the 3 organisations, each of them a group of groups, formed a bit of an alliance, which worked for quite a while on the Eyre Peninsula. I'm not sure that it's still functioning, but really did work as a collective of sort of regional scale bits of governance to try and have a single voice about some things and then do their own thing in things which didn't affect the others. So, I mean, that would be, for example, a model which could be bottom up, could be really encouraged. It would obviously be made easier if there was a bit of top-down facilitation and everything, but you could actually try and get it going bottom up anyway. And you could extend it beyond those 3 players to, for example, Indigenous organisations that operated in that region, or tourism interests or whatever. So I just wonder whether, a next step that the Outback Alliance in a way has been trying to do that at a national level, but is actually to try and facilitate different regions trying to pull together those sorts of alliances, and then perhaps have a bit of a network at the national level that might drive some of this forward more effectively. Because I guess I still just worry that we can sit here and see some really interesting and good things that have happened, and we can try and keep them going, but the resistance is always going to be there as people go back to their sort of day-to-day lives. So I'm just curious as to, that's just trying to pull some thoughts of people here together a bit.
it's the thing I struggle with, Mark, and all is, yeah, I keep circling back at it, and yeah, it's the size and scale of matters with our advocacy that always matters, and you know, there's the way I just sort of process what you said then is to engage more with regional Australia as distinct from remote, or separate them out to be part of a bigger spread. And then, of course, there's more transaction costs in doing that. Is that a pathway to go? It's interesting, my top of the head sake is there's so much more regional Australia. People, in terms of people and economic activity in different subsectors and so on, is to not do that because the transaction costs would be high. But I'd probably look back to the greater experience at the RAI, Regional Australia Institute, which Kim, of course, is co-leader of. Is that's what I struggle with. And I don't have any set answers. Is what's going to be the best strategy, the most effective strategy to cut through when we've always got the democracy deficit. We're not going to get rid of the democracy deficit. And sorry, that was Siri trying to give me an answer to that question, and she failed. Yeah, completely failed. Yeah, thank you, Bill Gates, or someone. Yeah, sorry, that's just a bit of possibly a negative musing, but whenever I scratch my head, I think just keep it to the outback. But it's a whole broader space that regional Australia faces as well, the democracy deficit in large part.
I think Jimmy's got a question that ties into that as well.
That's good, Tom. I was thinking about this too, just with the new national cabinet process that's been established and how that's actually cut COAG out of existence. And COAG had frameworks for local government and the local government associations to be able to participate and be sitting members in the COAG process. So I suppose just the fact that we've got the risk that we've got this national, war cabinet without an opposition leader in there as well, but how that might reduce the ability or the connections that local government has directly to the national governing processes. So there is a concern within the local government sector, and I'm a local councillor here in Alice Springs, that's an issue that we're going to have less say from local government being able to connect with the feds. So there is a bit of a risk, I suppose, from a democratic perspective, as local government's the closest layer of government to the people or to the community, and how our local government might be part of, or regional governments might be part of that solution. Because at the moment it feels like we're sort of heading towards a more kind of top-down command and control, approach, which kind of is a concern if we're looking at this kind of broader collaborative, collective, bottom-up approach. And I suppose just wanted to, put that into the mix of how we think about going forward too.
Any other comments on that? Yeah.
Kim had his hand up.
I'm going to shift over to gallery view so I can actually see when people have their hands up.
So, Andrew, in terms of response to Barry, over a decade of building alliances and driving and leading them and still being relatively sane, there's a couple of things that I think we need. Alliances are bloody hard work, and you need people and organisations who are willing, and I think we've definitely got that. You need a fair bit of resourcing, and I think between us we can get those resources. But probably more importantly, you need opportunity, and I come back to Frank's point, where I think right now there's a door that's partly open, and we definitely need to get our foot in there. I always come back, and so we get our foot in there. What do we use to force that door open? COVID and just a series of webinars might be something that helps us get in that door. It could be drought next year, it could be something else, and there always will be something we can go in there with. But I do wonder if now's not the opportunity. I always go back to Fred Cheney presenting at the Rangelands Forum in Alice Springs a couple of years ago, quite a few, I think, and come back to that 2012 paper that was commissioned, I think, by Desert Knowledge, Mark, and the 5 principles in that. And that's the thing that always sits at the bottom of my mind, and it's the thing that we need to get active. And I really think now, with that short period of opportunity, we as around this table here, plus a few more, really need to get our foot in that door and jam that door open, because I don't think it's going to be there very long.
I think too, if I could just add to that for a moment, just to extend my observation, and those representatives from government who've happily joined us might close their ears for a moment, or representative, because I don't want to confess that I'm going to do anything other than pursue government to help us out of this crisis. But just to reflect on our own camp for a while, the things that we mostly, or I'll speak for myself, the things that I mostly criticise government for are for announcing grand plans that don't ever seem to connect to local communities, that don't, actually meet the ground. I criticise government for having short-term ideas and priorities that chop and change. And I criticise them for lack of coordination across all of that effort. And I think if I was being honest, I could criticise ourselves of a similar set of sins, that we sometimes come up with these grand plans, but it's hard to see how those grand plans actually translate into concrete local action. Our priorities change and shift over time. We often don't coordinate with each other as well as we might. And none of that's to criticise everybody. We've all got, jobs to do and masters to be accountable to, and all of those sorts of things. And as somebody said, that coordination is really hard. I think that was you just then, Andrew. That coordination is really hard. And in a collective impact model, we see that level of coordination actually funded through that backbone activity, which is the part of collective action that people often forget, a funded sort of centralised coordination function that really does nothing but coordination is one of the keys to successful collective action. So I don't think we ought to have illusions about this being easy, but I do think we ought to recognise that the opposite of that for us means that we've got to coordinate, we've got to come up with some ideas that are long term, and we've got to come up with some ideas that are concrete and can be prosecuted in real local communities and make a difference. Otherwise, I think we're guilty of the same set of failures that many of us are likely to be critical of government for.
Okay, I'm going to jump in there. Kim, do you have one more point? I'm going to wrap it quite shortly because we are out of time. But if you've got a wrap up comment there.
Yeah, just a quick one. I think everybody's right. It is exhausting. This sort of level of coordination is exhausting, which is why we've seen so little of it driven from the top down. We know the feds have had an appetite for it through city deals and then through regional deals, but we also know they've discovered how exhausting it is. So the easiest thing for government is then to outsource all that to the community and wait for the community to sort of bring it together. I think what governments at all levels, even private investors too, they're looking for answers, right? So if that energy can be harnessed, if that resourcing can be done to bring those sort of answers together and de-risk it for an investor, whether it's public or private, we can get a long way further. But that is enormously exhausting on communities to bear the brunt of that. And everybody's quite right. It's got to be supported some way, public or private, philanthropic or government. It's got to be supported somehow.
All right, sounds like a good note to leave it on. I'm sure we could keep talking for hours and go round and round and up and down. But I think, what has come out of this is that there is a lot of work to do, and but a lot of need as well. And I think my take is that, everything that we've talked about throughout these sessions you know, the key themes that we've come out with, the key ideas are fantastic in, you know, this is a point that Jimmy touched on before. I think what works in one sector often has benefits across the board for the other ones too. So the value of cohesion and moving forward as a collective group together, you know, can't be underestimated. I guess the piece that we're not sure of is what that future looks like right at the moment with the way the virus is acting and where, you know, we'll be in 6, 12 to 18 months. Thanks everybody for joining us today and throughout the series. I think, as I just said, we've had some really fantastic presentations, and you know, for me, there's been some really insightful stuff come out, and I have no doubt that moving forward we'll be able to keep tying those threads together into something we can move forwards with. So I'm going to cut it off there, but thank you for joining us, and have an excellent rest of day and week.
Thanks, Edwina.
Thanks, Edwina. Thanks, Amber. Thanks, Dana, for the last 5 weeks of making this happen. So well done, and thank you very much.
Yeah, great stuff. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.